On the surface, everything about the Miles family looked like a picture straight out of a church calendar. Every Sunday morning, when the choir began their first hymn, the tall figure of Pastor Gregory Miles would step up to the pulpit at New Light Baptist Church. His voice carried weight. It wasn't just the booming tone or the carefully chosen scripture. It was the way he looked each member of his congregation in the eye, as though every word was meant for them alone. He was 42, sharp-jawed, charismatic, and known for sermons that drilled down on loyalty, family, and the sanctity of marriage. To the hundreds of people who filled those pews each week, Gregory wasn't just a preacher. He was the embodiment of faith in action. Sitting a few rows back, often quietly taking notes, was his wife Elaine. At 39, she didn't crave attention the way her husband did. Instead, she worked behind the scenes, managing church schedules, coordinating charity drives, and balancing budgets that no one else ever bothered to look at. Where Gregory was the face, Elaine was the spine, the one holding everything upright. People in the congregation admired her poise, the way she smiled politely but rarely spoke about herself. She seemed perfectly suited to the role of the pastor's wife, faithful, reserved, and always willing to put the mission before her own needs. To outsiders, they had it all. A beautiful brick home on the outskirts of town, 2 luxury cars in the driveway, and a marriage that looked unshakable. Their photographs, Gregory's hand firm on Elaine's shoulder, her expression calm, their smiles neat and practiced, were often used in church flyers and local magazines to advertise community events. The Miles family had become shorthand for what faith and discipline could accomplish. But as every true crime story begins, perfection has a way of hiding cracks. The first fracture didn't come from outside critics or even church politics. It walked straight through the front door, suitcase in hand, wearing a tired smile. Her name was Samantha Carter, Elaine's younger sister. At 33, she was freshly divorced and struggling to keep her life afloat. For months, Elaine had listened to her sister's late-night calls, the tears about unpaid bills, the loneliness that came with a failed marriage. So when Samantha finally asked if she could stay for a while, Elaine didn't hesitate. "Of course," she said. "This is your home, too." The congregation welcomed Samantha as warmly as they had once welcomed Elaine years earlier. She was charming in her own way, softer, less polished, but quick to laugh and even quicker to hug. At Sunday service, people commented on how wonderful it was to see the Miles family supporting her. In a community that prided itself on forgiveness and second chances, Samantha's arrival was almost celebrated. Inside the house, the arrangement felt natural at first. Elaine had her sister back, someone to share morning coffee with before the chaos of the day. Gregory, ever the pastor, offered words of encouragement to Samantha, reminding her that God had bigger plans and that this difficult season would one day be just a memory. To neighbors, it looked like a story of redemption. 2 sisters reunited, a preacher guiding them both, faith holding the family together. What no one noticed, at least not yet, was how easily Samantha slipped into the rhythm of their home. She helped set the table, joked with Gregory during dinner, and accompanied him on church errands when Elaine stayed behind to finish office work. It didn't feel suspicious at first. In fact, Elaine was grateful that her husband was kind enough to include her sister, to make her feel less like a burden and more like family. If you had walked into their living room on any given evening, you might have seen 3 people who seemed perfectly at ease. Gregory leaning back in his recliner with a glass of sweet tea, Elaine balancing the church's finance ledgers on her lap, Samantha stretched out on the couch laughing at some story. It was domestic harmony, warm, believable, enviable. But underneath, something was shifting, and though Elaine couldn't name it then, she would later look back at those nights with a bitter clarity, realizing they weren't scenes of comfort, but preludes to betrayal. New Light Baptist thrived during that season. Attendance grew, donations surged, and Gregory's reputation spread beyond the county line. Other churches invited him to speak, praising his ability to inspire with fire and tenderness in equal measure. People whispered about how lucky Elaine was to have him, how blessed she must feel to stand beside a man of such conviction. And each time Elaine heard those words, she nodded, smiled, and stayed silent, because that was the role she had chosen. Still, there were moments, tiny, fleeting moments, that unsettled her. The way Gregory's laugh seemed louder when Samantha was in the room. The way Samantha lingered in the kitchen a little longer after dinner, pouring herself another glass of wine when Gregory was still at the table. They were harmless details, barely worth a second thought. Yet somewhere deep inside, Elaine felt the first stirrings of unease, the faint intuition that the storybook life she had built might not be as solid as it looked from the outside. For now, though, the facade remained intact. The Miles family continued to shine as the cornerstone of their church and their community. But if you listened closely, closer than the congregation ever did, you might have heard it. The faint creak of wood under too much weight, the sound of cracks forming in a foundation that would one day collapse in gunfire. In the beginning, Samantha's presence felt like a blessing. Elaine had always been the responsible sister, the one who never strayed too far from church, never tested the edges of temptation. Samantha, on the other hand, had lived with a freer hand. She was the one who dyed her hair crimson in high school, the one who skipped choir practice to ride in the back of motorcycles, the one who had left Louisiana for a whirlwind marriage in Atlanta that had ended as quickly as it began. So when she showed up on Elaine's porch with nothing but a suitcase and eyes full of shame, Elaine felt a wave of maternal instinct. "You'll be safe here," she said, pulling her sister into an embrace. "We'll get you back on your feet." At first, Samantha seemed genuinely grateful. She threw herself into the routines of the Miles household, helping with laundry, cooking dinner, and even pitching in at the church office when Elaine's workload piled up. Congregation members admired her friendliness, the way she smiled easily and asked about their children. "That's Elaine's sister," they whispered to each other after service. "She's so lovely. How lucky she is to have family." And yet, as the days passed, little shifts began to unfold. Samantha started spending more time with Gregory, volunteering to run errands with him or staying late after Wednesday service to help tidy up. She would sit in the front pew during his sermons, eyes locked on him, nodding with an intensity that felt different from simple admiration. Gregory, ever the charismatic pastor, returned her attention with warmth. To outsiders, it looked like a man offering comfort to a broken woman. To Elaine, it was harder to ignore the chemistry that sparked in the pauses between their words. Still, Elaine silenced her doubts. After all, this was Gregory, the man who spoke from the pulpit about fidelity and sacrifice, the man who prayed with her before bed each night. And this was Samantha, her sister, her own flesh and blood. What kind of wife, what kind of sister would even imagine such a betrayal? But the signs only grew louder. One evening, Elaine came home early from a church board meeting and found the two of them in the kitchen. Nothing improper, at least not in a technical sense. Gregory was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, while Samantha sat on a stool sipping wine. They were laughing. Not the polite, surface-level laughter people shared during Bible study, but the easy, unguarded laughter of two people who had crossed some invisible line of intimacy. When they noticed Elaine in the doorway, the room fell quiet. Samantha quickly set down her glass. Gregory smiled too widely. "We were just talking about the choir," he said. Elaine forced a smile in return, but the pit in her stomach told her the conversation had nothing to do with music. After that, Elaine began noticing details that once would have slipped past her. A faint trace of perfume clinging to Gregory's suit jacket. Floral, not the kind she wore. Samantha borrowing Elaine's dresses without asking, and Gregory commenting, "That looks nice on you." The way Samantha's hand lingered on Gregory's arm during dinner prayers. Each piece alone was small, easy to excuse. Together, they painted a picture Elaine didn't want to see. It wasn't just inside the house. At church, Samantha's role seemed to expand overnight. She began helping with the youth choir, shadowing Gregory during community events, even stepping into conversations with deacons that Elaine once handled. When someone asked Gregory how he managed to balance so much, he chuckled and said, "I've got good help these days." He didn't look at Elaine when he said it. He looked at Samantha. The whispers started then. Not loud, not open, just murmurs in the church hallway, Glances exchanged in the parking lot. People noticed the closeness, even if they didn't dare speak it outright. And in a small southern congregation, whispers were often as dangerous as facts. At home, Elaine tried to reassert her place. She planned family dinners, suggested movie nights, reminded Gregory of the trips they used to take together. But the energy in the room had shifted. Gregory seemed distracted, checking his phone, excusing himself for late calls with church members. Samantha, meanwhile, grew bolder. She teased Gregory in front of Elaine, laughed at his jokes a little too loudly, stayed up with him long after Elaine went to bed. The fracture deepened on a rainy Friday night. Elaine had stayed late at the office finishing payroll when her phone buzzed with a message from a friend in the congregation. Just drove past the parsonage. Thought I saw Gregory's truck pulling out with a woman in the passenger seat. That you? Elaine froze. She hadn't seen Gregory since breakfast. And when she returned home hours later, both Gregory and Samantha were missing. They didn't come back until well past midnight. Gregory claimed he'd been helping a church member move furniture. Samantha said nothing at all, just brushed past Elaine on the stairs with a flushed face and tired eyes. That night, Elaine lay awake in the dark, listening to the sound of rain against the window and the faint creak of the floorboards as Gregory settled into bed beside her. She stared at the ceiling, her chest tight. The doubts she had tried to silence for weeks now screamed in her ears. She wanted to believe she was imagining it, that her husband's reputation and her sister's vulnerability couldn't possibly intersect into something so cruel. But deep down, she already knew. By the time morning came, the seed of suspicion had grown into something heavier, something like certainty. Elaine rose before dawn, brewed coffee, and sat at the kitchen table watching the steam curl into the air. Across the hall, she could hear Samantha's laughter echoing from the guest room, mingled with Gregory's voice. It wasn't just her imagination anymore. The walls of her perfect life were starting to close in, and she felt powerless to stop them. The intrusion hadn't been sudden. It had been quiet, almost gentle. Samantha hadn't stormed into her sister's marriage like a thief. She had slipped into it, piece by piece, until Elaine realized she was no longer the only woman Gregory turned to for comfort. The betrayal wasn't official, not yet, but Elaine could feel it in her bones. The bond between her husband and her sister was tightening, and her place in the story she thought she was living was slowly being erased. What she didn't know was how far they had already gone, or how far she herself would be willing to go once the truth could no longer be ignored. The first undeniable sign came on a Tuesday morning. Elaine was folding laundry when she picked up Gregory's dress shirt and caught the faint scent of perfume. It wasn't hers. She wore light vanilla, the same fragrance she had used for years. This was different, stronger, floral, with a sharpness that clung to the fabric. She held the shirt closer, her hands trembling as the realization settled in. For a moment, she told herself it could have been from a church member, maybe an innocent hug after service. But her heart told her otherwise. After that, she noticed more things. The church security camera outside the office, which usually pointed directly at the parking lot, had been tilted up toward the sky. Must have been a storm, Gregory muttered when she asked. But Elaine had checked the weather reports. No storm. One evening, she drove past the church unexpectedly after running errands. She spotted Gregory's truck parked out front. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was seeing Samantha's car parked right beside it, even though Samantha had told Elaine earlier that she was staying home with a headache. Elaine slowed her car, staring at the two vehicles lined up together in the darkened lot. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Instead, she kept driving, her pulse hammering in her ears. The next morning, Gregory came home later than usual from counseling a parishioner. Samantha's eyes were bloodshot at breakfast. Elaine said nothing, just watched as her sister avoided her gaze, and her husband poured himself another cup of coffee like nothing was amiss. But silence can only hold for so long. The confirmation she had dreaded came in the form of a message. Gregory had left his phone on the counter while taking a shower. Elaine never snooped before, but her fingers acted before her conscience could catch up. She unlocked the phone and saw a text preview. I can't stop thinking about last night. The message was from Samantha. Her world tilted. Elaine's breath caught in her throat as her eyes scanned the thread. Fragments of late-night whispers, coded words that were no longer coded at all. There it was, spelled out in black and white. Her husband and her sister were lovers. She put the phone back exactly where it had been and sat at the kitchen table, numb. She waited until Gregory came down, kissed her on the cheek, and left for the day. He never noticed the way her body stiffened under his touch. Still, Elaine didn't confront them. Not yet. She needed to be sure. Over the following weeks, she began her own quiet investigation. She kept a journal, jotting down every time Gregory came home late, every excuse Samantha gave, every shift in their stories. She snapped photos of hotel receipts she found tucked into Gregory's wallet. She screenshotted texts when Samantha carelessly left her phone charging in the living room. Each detail stacked on top of the other until Elaine's journal was no longer just a collection of suspicions. It was a dossier of betrayal. Her breaking point came on a chilly Thursday evening. She had left the church office earlier than usual, her nerves pulling her toward the truth she both craved and feared. As she drove past a roadside motel just outside of town, her headlights swept over two familiar vehicles, Gregory's truck and Samantha's car, parked side by side. This time, she didn't keep driving. She pulled into the gas station across the street and sat with her engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight her knuckles whitened. A neon motel sign flickered above the parking lot, buzzing faintly like an accusation. Elaine waited, minutes stretching into hours, until finally she saw them emerge. Gregory, his arm brushing Samantha's shoulder, their bodies too close, their faces lit with the kind of glow that didn't come from prayer. Elaine's chest heaved. She pressed a hand against her sternum as if trying to keep her heart from breaking through. She wanted to storm across the road, to scream, to claw at them with all the fury boiling inside. But she didn't. She stayed frozen in her car, watching her husband and her sister disappear into the night together. When she finally drove home, her mind was no longer a storm of doubt. It was clarity, cold, sharp, and merciless. The marriage she had spent 2 decades building was over. Her sister had not only betrayed her, but stolen the one thing Elaine thought was untouchable, Gregory's loyalty. That night, Elaine sat at the kitchen table again, flipping through her journal. Each entry was proof, each line of ink a dagger to her chest. She thought of the sermons Gregory had preached, his booming voice declaring, "Marriage is a sacred covenant not to be broken by lust or temptation." The hypocrisy burned her from the inside out. Her prayers turned bitter. "God, why?" she whispered into the silence. "Why him? Why her? Why me?" There was no answer, only the hum of the refrigerator and the echo of her own ragged breathing. Days bled into each other. Gregory grew more careless, Samantha more emboldened. They came home together once, laughing like teenagers, their mirth halting abruptly when Elaine appeared at the top of the stairs. They covered with excuses, but Elaine didn't even need to listen. Their faces told the truth. The whispers in the congregation grew louder. A deacon's wife asked Elaine if everything was all right at home, her eyes searching with too much knowing. Elaine forced a smile, insisting all was well, but the question lingered. How much did people already suspect? How much longer before the scandal broke, wide open? One evening, Elaine found herself at a pawn shop on the edge of town. She wasn't sure what had drawn her there. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was despair, maybe it was the feeling of being cornered. She walked out with a small revolver tucked into her purse, hidden beneath receipts and tissues. For weeks, she told herself it was just for protection, a precaution in a dangerous world. But deep down, she knew it was something else. Her journal grew thicker. Photos, screenshots, receipts, motel sightings. Her secret archive of betrayal now sat locked in her desk drawer, a constant reminder that the people she trusted most had torn her life apart. Every time she opened it, she felt both vindicated and poisoned. Elaine was no longer the quiet pastor's wife, content to live in her husband's shadow. She had become something harder, sharper. She knew the truth now. And with each passing day, the question burned hotter inside her. What would she do with it? And when the moment finally came, when suspicion turned into confrontation, Elaine already knew the answer. Elaine no longer lived in a haze of doubt. By the time she saw Gregory and Samantha walk out of that motel together, the truth was cemented. What had begun as whispers in her head had become a deafening roar. Her husband, the man who preached fidelity from the pulpit, was sleeping with her own sister. And not only had they broken her trust, they had made a fool out of her in front of God, the church, and herself. She began to treat her house like a crime scene. Every detail mattered. She gathered evidence with the precision of a detective, documenting the slow unraveling of her life. Each evening when Gregory was out, Elaine sat at the kitchen table with her leather-bound journal, carefully sliding photos and printouts into its pages. She tucked away screenshots of text messages she had forwarded to herself, hotel receipts she had fished from his pockets, and dates she had circled in red ink. She even noted the tone of Samantha's voice when she returned late, or the way Gregory's cologne clung to her sister's clothes. It wasn't enough to know they were betraying her. She needed proof, hard, undeniable proof. Some part of her thought maybe one day she would present it all to Gregory, slam the binder on the table, and force him to see what he had done. Another part whispered that the file wasn't for him at all. It was for her, to remind herself she wasn't crazy, that she hadn't imagined the years of lies. Her days blurred into rituals of observation. She checked the odometer on Gregory's truck before and after he left for counseling sessions. She scrolled through Samantha's purse when her sister showered, snapping photos of hotel key cards tucked into the side pocket. One afternoon, she even followed them, her hands clammy against the steering wheel, keeping 2 car lengths behind as Gregory and Samantha's vehicles wound down a back road toward the edge of town. She didn't need to see them disappear into another motel parking lot. She already knew where they were going. But she wrote it down anyway, her pen pressing so hard into the page it nearly tore the paper. In the quiet hours of the night, Elaine wrestled with herself. She prayed. At first, the prayers were desperate pleas for guidance. Lord, tell me what to do. Show me a way to forgive. But as the weeks wore on, her words hardened into curses. Let them feel what I feel. Let their sin be punished. Each prayer became less about healing and more about justice. Justice she no longer trusted God to deliver. That was when she started thinking about the gun. At first, it was only a fleeting thought, one she brushed away as quickly as it appeared. She had never even held a weapon before. But the more she stewed in her betrayal, the more the idea returned. One morning, on her way home from the church office, she found herself parked in front of a pawn shop on the edge of town. She sat in the driver's seat for nearly 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel, her mind teetering between walking in or driving away. Finally, she opened the door. Inside, the air smelled of dust and metal. The man behind the counter barely glanced at her. He asked no questions when she pointed to a revolver in the glass case, small enough to hide, but heavy enough to do real damage. The paperwork was minimal. The transaction, disturbingly easy. When Elaine walked out with the gun wrapped in brown paper, her heart pounded like she had just committed a sin she couldn't undo. She had the weapon in the back of her closet, beneath shoeboxes no one ever touched. For days, she told herself it was for protection. After all, the world was dangerous, wasn't it? A pastor's wife deserved to feel safe. But each time she brushed past that closet, each time she caught a glimpse of the paper bag tucked away, she knew safety had nothing to do with it. The gun was a promise, a silent answer waiting for the right moment. Her journal grew thicker. It wasn't just notes anymore. It was a record of her transformation. She clipped the motel receipts with paper clips, slid photos into plastic sleeves, even printed out copies of the text to arrange them like evidence in a trial. She became obsessed with the completeness of it. As though if she could catalog every betrayal, she could finally make sense of her own rage. But rage doesn't live on paper. It lives in the body, in the tightening of Elaine's jaw when Gregory kissed her goodnight, in the way her hands trembled when Samantha poured another glass of wine in the kitchen. It lived in the pounding of her heart every time she opened the closet door. The house itself began to feel hostile. Elaine heard laughter from the living room and felt her stomach twist. She watched Gregory lean across the dinner table to refill Samantha's glass and bit her tongue until it bled. Every gesture became a spark, and Elaine was a tinderbox waiting for a single strike. One night, she sat alone at the kitchen table, the revolver in front of her. She turned it over in her hands, watching the way the metal gleamed under the soft light. She thought about the vows Gregory had spoken to her 20 years ago, the promises Samantha had whispered through tears when she first moved in, the sermons about loyalty that had filled the church hall each Sunday. She thought about the image of their family plastered across church flyers, about how everyone believed they were the perfect example of God's grace. The hypocrisy was suffocating. Elaine placed the gun back in its hiding spot and shut the closet door. But in her mind, the decision had already been made. She didn't know when, she didn't know how, but she knew the day would come when the weight of her evidence, her betrayal, and her fury would demand release. And when it did, the gun would be ready. What had started as suspicion had become certainty. What had started as certainty had become obsession. And now, obsession was becoming something far darker: preparation. Elaine wasn't just a wife anymore. She wasn't just a sister. She was a woman scorned, armed with proof, armed with a weapon, and armed with the conviction that one way or another, justice was going to be served. It was a Friday evening in late spring when the carefully stacked cards of Elaine's life finally collapsed. She had left the church office earlier than usual, claiming fatigue, but in truth her nerves had been crackling all day. Something in her gut told her tonight would be different. The sky hung low with heavy clouds, the kind that made the air feel charged, as if a storm was waiting to break. Elaine's car rolled quietly into the driveway. From the outside, the house looked warm and inviting, a golden glow spilling from the front windows. But the moment she opened the door, she heard it. Laughter. Not just any laughter. Gregory's, deep and full, mingled with Samantha's lighter, teasing giggle. It came from the living room, where glasses clinked faintly against each other. Her pulse quickened. She stood in the hallway, coat still on, purse still slung over her shoulder, straining to listen. Gregory's voice carried first. "You always know how to lighten the mood." Samantha's reply followed, soft and intimate. "That's because I know you better than anyone." Then the unmistakable sound of wine being poured. Elaine's chest tightened until she could hardly breathe. She stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The scene came into view. Gregory in his favorite recliner, shirt collar loosened, his tie draped carelessly over the armrest. Samantha sat curled on the couch, one leg tucked under her, holding a wine glass in her hand. They looked too comfortable, too close. It was a picture of domesticity, but Elaine was nowhere in it. For a moment, she just stood there, frozen in the doorway. Neither of them noticed her. Gregory leaned toward Samantha, their conversation so low she couldn't hear the words, only the intimate cadence of their voices. Samantha's laughter floated up again, filling the room like a knife twisting in Elaine's gut. Her hand slipped in her purse, almost without thought. She felt the cold weight of the revolver pressing into her palm. The very thing she had hidden away, sworn she'd never use unless she had no other choice. It was suddenly the only thing she could feel, the only thing she could trust. Gregory. Her voice cut through the room like glass shattering. He jerked his head up, startled. Samantha turned too, her eyes wide. The wine glass slipped from her hand, tipping over onto the rug, red liquid spreading like blood across the cream fabric. "Elaine," Gregory started, his tone half soothing, half nervous. "What are you doing home so early?" She stepped forward, the revolver now visible in her hand. Her voice shook, but her grip did not. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare lie to me." Samantha shot to her feet, hands trembling. "Elaine, please, it's not." "Shut your mouth." Elaine's eyes blazed, fixed on her sister. "I opened my home to you. I trusted you. And this is how you repay me." Gregory rose slowly from his chair, hands outstretched. "Elaine, I know how this looks, but we can talk about it. Put the gun down. You don't want to do this." Her laugh was bitter, sharp. "Don't I? Do you know what it's like to lie awake every night, hearing the two of you in this house and my house? Do you know what it's like to be mocked by your own blood, to be betrayed by the man who preaches faithfulness every Sunday? The words poured out of her in a torrent, years of suppressed pain boiling over. Tears streamed down her face, but her hand never wavered. Gregory took a cautious step closer. "Elaine," he said softly, like he was addressing a frightened animal. "I made mistakes. I'm not proud of it. But this isn't the way. Think about what you're doing. Think about the church. Think about your life." "My life?" she snapped, her voice cracking. "You destroyed my life the moment you touched her. You stood in God's house and lied to everyone, including me. Don't you dare talk to me about life." Her finger tightened on the trigger. For a fleeting second, Gregory's eyes widened with real fear. He raised his hands higher, palms open. "Elaine, please," Samantha sobbed. "He promised me. He said he'd leave you after Easter. I didn't mean for this to." The confession was gasoline on an already raging fire. Elaine's vision tunneled. The last barrier of denial shattered. The gun went off. The sound was deafening, a single thunderclap that shook the walls. Gregory staggered backward, his face frozen in shock. His hands clutched at his chest where the bullet had torn through, crimson blooming against his shirt. He collapsed into the recliner, gasping, eyes wide and glassy. Samantha screamed, a raw, animal sound, before bolting for the door. She stumbled into the night, shrieking for help, her voice echoing down the quiet street. Elaine stood rooted to the spot, the revolver still smoking in her hand. The acrid scent of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the sharp tang of spilled wine. Her ears rang, drowning out Gregory's wet, ragged breaths. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in silence, as if time itself had stopped to witness what she had done. Gregory's voice finally broke through, hoarse and weak. "Elaine, why?" Her lips trembled, but no words came. She wanted to scream at him, to remind him of every promise he'd broken, every lie he'd told, every sermon he'd preached about loyalty while he desecrated their marriage bed. But the words lodged in her throat. All that came out was a strangled sob. In the distance, sirens began to wail. Samantha's cries had reached the neighbors. Lights flicked on across the street. Shadows moved in windows. The world was waking to the nightmare inside the Miles household. Elaine lowered the gun at last, her arm suddenly heavy, as though the weight of everything she had done had finally settled on her shoulders. Gregory slumped sideways in the chair, his breath shallow, his eyes fluttering closed. The front door burst open. Neighbors rushed in, then froze at the sight of the pastor bleeding out in his living room, his wife standing over him with a revolver dangling from her hand. Behind them, flashing blue and red lights filled the street. Elaine didn't resist when the officers grabbed her, didn't protest when they wrenched the gun from her grasp and pushed her to the floor. She knelt in the shards of her broken life, wrists bound, tears streaming down her face as Gregory was carried past her on a stretcher, still clinging to a sliver of life. The night that had begun with laughter and wine ended in blood and sirens. And for the first time in her life, Elaine Miles wasn't the pastor's wife or the dutiful sister. She was something else entirely, a woman who had finally decided enough was enough. The sound of the gunshot still seemed to vibrate in Elaine's bones as the flashing blue and red lights spilled across the front lawn. Within minutes, the quiet street that had so often hosted Sunday barbecues and block parties was transformed into a crime scene. Neighbors stood barefoot in their driveways, whispering and pointing, their faces pale with shock. Inside the Miles home, the smell of blood and cordite hung thick in the air. Elaine sat on the living room floor, wrists bound in cold steel. She didn't fight the officers who pushed her down. She didn't even speak. Her eyes were fixed on Gregory as paramedics worked frantically to stabilize him, their hands moving in precise, urgent motions. His shirt had been cut open, his chest slick with blood. The man who had once commanded a congregation of hundreds now looked small, fragile, and utterly mortal. Samantha stood outside on the porch, wrapped in a neighbor's blanket, her sobs echoing into the night. She kept repeating the same words over and over. She shot him. She shot him. My sister shot him. Her voice carried, and with every repetition, the truth of the betrayal seemed to deepen for Elaine. The officers guided Elaine to her feet and marched her out the door. The crowd outside parted in silence, eyes wide as they watched the pastor's wife, usually so composed, so gracious, shuffle past in handcuffs. For years, these same people had admired her as the perfect partner to their beloved pastor. Now, she was just another headline waiting to be written. Gregory was rushed into the back of an ambulance, his body barely clinging to life. One paramedic shouted to the driver, "Go, go, go." The vehicle roared off, siren piercing the night. Elaine's heart clenched at the sound. She had wanted to punish him, yes, but seeing him crumpled and pale under the harsh fluorescent lights forced her to confront the reality. She had nearly killed the man she once vowed to love until death. At the police station, the booking process blurred together. Fingerprints, mugshots, questions barked by detectives. Elaine barely registered any of it. When they asked why she did it, her voice came out hollow, like an echo in a cave. Because he betrayed me. Because they both did. She offered no further defense, no denial, no attempt to soften the truth. Meanwhile, word spread like wildfire. By dawn, the news had reached every corner of the congregation. Phones rang through the night, members waking one another with disbelief. Did you hear? Pastor Miles was shot. By his wife. The story seemed impossible, like a cruel rumor designed to tear the church apart. But as details trickled in, the ambulance, the police cars, Elaine in cuffs, the impossible hardened into fact. When Sunday morning arrived, New Light Baptist Church was packed, not with the faithful hungry for a sermon, but with a congregation desperate for answers. The pulpit stood empty. A guest deacon tried to lead prayers, but the air was heavy with confusion and betrayal. Parents whispered explanations to their children. Longtime members wept openly. Others slipped out the back doors, unwilling to stay in a place now stained by scandal. Back at the hospital, Gregory clung stubbornly to life. The bullet had missed his heart by inches, tearing through muscle and lodging dangerously close to an artery. Surgeons worked for hours before finally declaring him stable, though his recovery would be long and painful. When he woke briefly, groggy under the haze of medication, the first words out of his mouth were not for God, not for the church, but for Samantha. "Is she safe?" he whispered. The nurses exchanged uneasy glances. Samantha, meanwhile, became the focus of local gossip. Neighbors called her a homewrecker, a snake. Others pitted her, claiming she had been manipulated by a powerful man who used scripture as cover for his sins. Reporters camped outside the hospital and the police station, eager to catch even a glimpse of the fallen pastor or the wife who had pulled the trigger. Elaine spent her first night in jail alone, staring at the concrete wall of her cell. For years, she had lived in the shadow of her husband's pulpit, her identity tied to his reputation. Now, stripped of everything, she finally had space to think. But the thoughts that came were jagged, tormenting. She replayed the moment again and again. Gregory's startled eyes, Samantha's scream, the deafening crack of the revolver. She wondered if she had damned herself forever, not just in the eyes of the law, but in the eyes of God. In the morning, detectives returned with more questions. Did she plan it? How long had she suspected? Why by the gun weeks before? Elaine's silence was heavy, but every detail of her journal, every receipt and screenshot hidden in her drawer back home, painted the picture for them. The prosecutors would have more than enough to prove intent. Yet, beneath the weight of evidence, there lingered another truth, one the community couldn't stop debating. Elaine had acted out of rage, yes, but also out of heartbreak. She hadn't planned to become a killer. She had been pushed, step by step, into a corner until violence felt like the only way out. As the sun set the following day, New Light Baptist's front lawn became a gathering place for reporters. Cameras flashed. Microphones pointed toward tearful church members who struggled to reconcile the man they once revered with the scandal now attached to his name. For decades, The church had been a beacon of stability. Now it was the epicenter of chaos. And in the middle of it all, 3 lives lay in ruins. Gregory, fighting to survive his wounds. Samantha, branded and shunned. And Elaine, sitting in a cold cell, wondering how a woman who once believed in forgiveness had become the very thing she used to fear, an avenger with blood on her hands. At first, Elaine thought the silence would protect her, that if she simply said little, perhaps her version of the truth would remain clouded, sympathetic, an overwhelmed wife who snapped in a moment of despair. But within days of the shooting, the silence shattered, and with it came revelations that turned the private betrayal into a public spectacle. The detectives pressed Samantha first. She had been the one screaming in the street, the one who ran barefoot to the neighbor's door, sobbing that her sister had shot Gregory. When they brought her downtown, she looked small and hollow, wrapped in a borrowed sweatshirt, eyes ringed with exhaustion. At first she tried to shield herself, muttering that she didn't want to talk, that this was between Gregory and Elaine. But the weight of what had happened crushed her defenses. It wasn't just one mistake, Samantha finally whispered, voice breaking. It wasn't a fling. We've been together for months. The words landed like bombs. She admitted she and Gregory had been seeing each other secretly since late winter, slipping into motels, sneaking kisses in the church office when no one else was around. He had told her he loved her. He had told her that after Easter, after he finished a sermon series on resurrection and renewal, he would leave Elaine. The detectives scribbled notes as Samantha broke down completely. "I never meant to hurt my sister," she cried, hands shaking. "She gave me a home when I had nothing. But Gregory, he made me feel seen again. He promised me everything." When word of her confession leaked, the community turned vicious. Parishioners who had once welcomed her with open arms now spat her name with venom. Some called her a temptress who had ruined a holy man. Others called her a victim, a lonely woman manipulated by someone with spiritual authority. But no matter the perspective, one truth was undeniable. The facade of the Miles family had crumbled beyond repair. Gregory, still recovering in the hospital, tried at first to deny everything. When detectives visited his bedside, he insisted he and Samantha had never crossed a line, that Elaine had been delusional, unstable, a woman cracking under the pressures of pastoral life. But the receipts Elaine had gathered told a different story. So did Samantha's tearful admissions. And when they showed Gregory a printed transcript of the text messages Elaine had saved, lines like "next Easter, we'll start fresh," and "I dream about waking up beside you," not her, the denial drained from his face. He turned his head toward the window, unable to meet the detective's eyes. "I made mistakes," he finally muttered, "but I never thought it would come to this. I never thought she'd pull a gun." His voice cracked on the last word, a mix of shame and disbelief. For Elaine, the revelations brought no relief. Sitting in her cell, she heard pieces of the confessions filtered back through her attorney. Instead of softening her rage, the confirmation hardened it. Every line Samantha uttered, every half-admission Gregory made, was salt poured into an open wound. She had been right all along, and yet being right offered no comfort. The betrayal had been real, deliberate, and prolonged. In the press, the story took on a life of its own. Headlines screamed across local and national outlets. "Pastor preaches fidelity. Caught an affair with wife's sister," and "Holy scandal in New Light Baptist. Betrayal ends in gunfire." Reporters staked out the courthouse steps, shoving microphones in the faces of church members, hungry for any shred of commentary. Some defended Gregory, calling him only human, a man who had stumbled but didn't deserve a bullet in his chest. Others condemned him, saying he had used the pulpit as a shield while living a lie. The deeper the investigation dug, the more hypocrisy surfaced. A deacon admitted he had once warned Gregory about spending too much time with Samantha. Another parishioner confessed to spotting them at a diner late at night. The community realized that the signs had been there all along. They had simply chosen not to see. When prosecutors questioned Elaine, her composure finally cracked. For weeks, she had maintained a cold stillness, refusing to give them the satisfaction of an emotional outburst. But the moment they asked why she pulled the trigger, her voice exploded. "Why?" she spat. Because I opened my home to her, and he turned my sister into his whore. Because I stood by him for 20 years, and he threw it away like it was nothing. Because every time he looked me in the eye and told me he loved me, he was already planning to leave me. That's why. Her words echoed through the room, the kind of raw confession that no jury could ever forget. The legal picture grew clearer. The affair was undeniable, the betrayal public. But the question remained, was Elaine's act premeditated murder or the desperate spiral of a broken woman pushed past her breaking point? The prosecution leaned on the revolver purchase, the meticulous journal of evidence. The defense leaned on the human cost of betrayal, the collapse of a woman's world under the weight of hypocrisy. What had once been a private family secret was now dissected in court documents, news stories, and coffee shop gossip. There were no more illusions left to protect. The Miles family had been stripped bare, their sins exposed under the harshest of lights. And at the center of it all, Elaine sat in silence, no longer the smiling pastor's wife, no longer the dutiful administrator. She was the woman who had pulled the trigger, but also the woman who, for the first time in her life, finally told the truth out loud. The truth had been buried for months, maybe years. Now it was in the open, and the only question left was how much that truth would cost her. The courthouse in Baton Rouge was packed from the first day of the trial. Journalists lined the steps before dawn, their cameras flashing as Elaine Miles was escorted inside, wrists shackled, eyes cast downward. The trial wasn't just about a woman who had shot her husband. It was about the fall of a pastor who once stood as a pillar of fidelity and the unraveling of a family whose image had been sold as flawless. The pews of the courtroom filled with members of New Light Baptist Church, some there to support Gregory, others curious to witness the spectacle of their spiritual leaders torn apart. From the start, the prosecution painted Elaine as a calculating woman who had chosen violence over divorce. They presented the revolver she purchased weeks in advance, the journal filled with notes and evidence of Gregory's infidelity, the receipts she meticulously collected. This was not a crime of passion, the district attorney told the jury, his voice booming. This was premeditation. This was revenge, carried out with cold, deliberate intent. He held up the pawn shop receipt for the gun, then turned to the jury. You don't buy a weapon, hide it in your closet, and then, by coincidence, shoot your husband in the chest when you find him at home with your sister. This was planned. This was thought out. This was attempted murder. The defense countered with a different story. Elaine's lawyer, a gray-haired man with a calm but firm voice, leaned heavily into the narrative of a woman betrayed beyond endurance. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, you are not looking at a criminal mastermind. You are looking at a wife who gave 20 years of her life to a man who stood at a pulpit and lied to her face week after week. You are looking at a sister who opened her home to family, only to be betrayed in the cruelest way possible. Elaine did not plan this. She broke, and anyone, pushed far enough, betrayed deeply enough, could break too. To support their case, the defense called psychologists who testified about Elaine's mental state. One expert explained that long-term betrayal by both a spouse and a sibling could trigger what is known as an acute stress reaction, an eruption of uncontrollable rage that clouds rational judgment. Elaine's tears during these testimonies weren't rehearsed. They poured out, raw and unfiltered, as she clutched tissues and buried her face in her hands. The prosecution, however, had Samantha. Under oath, Samantha admitted to the affair, but described the night of the shooting with haunting detail. Elaine came in holding the gun, she said, voice trembling. We begged her to put it down. Gregory tried to calm her, but she screamed at us, called me a whore. And then she pulled the trigger. She didn't hesitate. Her testimony left the courtroom in stunned silence. In the gallery, members of the congregation shifted uncomfortably. For all of Gregory's sins, hearing that his wife shot him at point-blank range without pause cast Elaine in a darker light. When Gregory himself took the stand, the tension in the room was electric. His chest bore the scar of the bullet wound, and his voice was weaker than it once had been. Yet he still carried a preacher's cadence. I have made mistakes, he said solemnly, turning toward the jury. I'm not a perfect man. but I did not deserve to be shot by my wife. Marriage vows are sacred, but so is life. And she tried to take mine. His words landed heavily, and some jurors averted their eyes. Closing arguments crystallized the clash of perspectives. The prosecution hammered home the idea of intent. The gun purchase, the journal, the months of suspicion. This was not spur of the moment, the district attorney repeated. This was an execution waiting for the right time. The defense begged the jury to look at Elaine not as a villain, but as a human being whose soul had been crushed by betrayal. Do not judge her for one bullet without judging him for the 100 lies that came before it, her lawyer implored. This is not attempted murder. This is the eruption of a broken heart. When the jury retired to deliberate, the courtroom buzzed with whispers. Hours stretched into nearly 2 days. Reporters camped outside, broadcasting updates with breathless anticipation. Inside her holding cell, Elaine prayed not for freedom, but for peace, though she admitted to herself she no longer knew what peace meant. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, his face unreadable. We find the defendant, Elaine Miles, guilty of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon. The words rippled through the room. Not attempted murder, not premeditated homicide. Something less, serious, but softened by the jury's recognition of the pain that had driven her. The judge, stern and unmoved, handed down the sentence. 8 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 5. Elaine closed her eyes as the gavel struck. She wasn't free, but she wasn't condemned to life either. In a way, it felt like a strange mercy. Gregory's supporters called the verdict a travesty, insisting justice hadn't been served. Samantha vanished from the public eye, refusing interviews, changing her name before leaving the state. And the church, once a thriving congregation of 400, fractured. Nearly half its members left within months, unwilling to worship under the shadow of scandal. As guards led Elaine away, she glanced back only once. She saw Gregory sitting stiffly on the bench, his face pale, his eyes unreadable. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw regret flicker there, not for what she had done, but for what he had caused. Then the doors closed, and the chapter ended. The court had spoken. The law had decided. But in Baton Rouge, in a hollow shell of New Light Baptist Church, the debate would rage on for years. Was Elaine a criminal, or just the final victim of a betrayal too heavy for any heart to bear? In the weeks after the trial, Baton Rouge still hummed with the echoes of the scandal. New Light Baptist Church, once the proud centerpiece of its community, became a husk of what it had been. The sanctuary still stood, pews polished and hymns printed neatly in the back of the books, but the crowds thinned to a trickle. Families who once filled the parking lot every Sunday morning now drove past in silence, ashamed or unwilling to be tied to a church whose pastor had been caught in such hypocrisy. What had been a place of worship became, in the eyes of many, a cautionary tale. Gregory never returned to the pulpit. After months of physical therapy and recovery from his wound, he packed up quietly and left the city. He could no longer bear the whispers, nor the sight of the pulpit where he once thundered about loyalty while living a lie. Some said he moved to Texas. Others whispered he sought refuge with a small congregation out of state. What everyone knew for certain was that the man who had been hailed as a spiritual leader was now remembered as the pastor who betrayed both God and his wife. Even when he tried to rebuild, the shadow of Elaine's bullet followed him. Samantha fled even sooner. Her confession had made her name toxic in Baton Rouge. Friends cut ties, neighbors avoided her, and church members treated her like a scarlet letter come to life. Within a month of the trial, she sold her car, changed her last name, and disappeared. Some believed she moved north to live with distant relatives. Others claimed she found work under an assumed identity. Wherever she went, she carried the burden of being branded the other woman who destroyed not just her sister's marriage, but the reputation of an entire church. Elaine's path was the clearest, though hardly enviable. Prison became her new world, a place stripped of pews and hymnals, replaced with gray walls and routine. At first, she was consumed by shame. The image of Gregory bleeding in that recliner haunted her dreams, replaying every night like a punishment she couldn't escape. But as months turned into years, something inside her shifted. She began attending therapy groups, sitting in circles with women whose lives had also imploded under the weight of violence and betrayal. Some killed abusers. Some lost everything to drugs. Some, like her, had simply broken under too much pain. In those meetings, Elaine found a strange kind of clarity. She stopped justifying her act as justice and began to understand it for what it was. Desperation weaponized. She wrote letters to Gregory, to Samantha, even to members of the church, but never sent them. In the letters, she poured out her anger, her sorrow, and eventually, her forgiveness. They filled notebooks stacked under her bunk, a private testimony no jury would ever hear. After 5 years, Elaine was granted parole. She walked out of prison older, thinner, and quieter. The woman who once organized church ledgers and smiled politely at congregants had been replaced by someone who carried her scars openly. She didn't return to Baton Rouge. Instead, she moved to a small rental house in another parish, living quietly, working odd jobs, and trying to stitch together something resembling peace. For the community, the story of the Miles family became lore, retold in hushed tones at family dinners and Sunday schools, a warning about betrayal, about secrets, about how quickly sin can unravel even the most respected lives. The church never regained its former glory. Half-empty pews stood as a reminder that faith without honesty crumbles under its own weight. Years later, when people passed by the old sanctuary, some still whispered about the night the pastor's wife pulled a gun. Others shook their heads at the memory of the sisters whose love for the same man destroyed them both. And a few, the ones who knew Elaine best, quietly wondered if she had finally found the forgiveness she had once begged for on her knees. For Gregory, for Samantha, for Elaine, the verdict didn't end the story. It only marked the beginning of 3 broken lives, each scattered in different directions, each haunted by the same night. And for the town of Baton Rouge, the name Miles no longer brought to mind sermons about loyalty and family. It brought to mind the sound of a single gunshot and the truth it revealed, that sometimes the deadliest betrayals don't come from strangers, but from the people you love most.